She was looking for a way out of everything. He gave her a meal, a porch, and a reason to stay. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind whistled through the cracked window panes of the old farmhouse, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and the kind of cold that slipped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. John Carter stood in his dimly lit kitchen, hands braced against the chipped counter, staring at the last few cans lined up like stubborn soldiers on a shelf he built himself nearly 30 years ago. Corn, beans, a dented can of stewed tomatoes. That was it. Not enough for a feast, but just enough for a man who'd learned how to stretch what little he had without complaint. He reached for the beans first, the label half peeled from time and heat. His fingers worked steadily, almost rhythmically, as he opened each can and dumped their contents into the pot on the stove. He added a pinch of salt, a splash of oil, and a whisper of pepper. No recipe, just instinct. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and in John's world, warm was enough. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background, its sound a constant reminder of how slowly and quickly time passed all at once. Dinner for one was a quiet ritual these days. The radio played low, some old country song that talked about lost highways and coming home. John hummed along without really listening, the same way he did most nights, just to keep the silence from swallowing him whole. He didn't think of himself as poor, even if the bank statement said otherwise. The crops had been cruel this season. The weather hadn't helped. The tractor was on its last breath, and the mortgage hung heavy like a storm cloud that refused to rain. Still, there was pride in the way he stirred the pot, in the way he set the table with care. One bowl, one spoon, one folded napkin. It wasn't about the food. It was about the dignity of showing up for yourself, even when no one else was looking. As the stew simmered, John sat by the window, watching the sun dip low over the barren fields, painting the sky in strokes of orange and rust. He didn't know it yet, but someone was coming. Someone cold, lost, and half-starved, for food, yes, but also for something much rarer, kindness. The sun sagged low, casting long shadows over the fields that once promised more than they gave. Golden light skimmed across the rusted fence posts and the empty rows of turned soil, painting the land in a warm glow that belied how cold the air had turned. Inside the house, John Carter lifted his bowl of stew, barely a ladleful, but enough to take the edge off the ache in his belly, and settled near the window, where he could watch what remained of the day vanish behind the barn. The wind had picked up, slipping through the gaps in the old farmhouse like a ghost with unfinished business. He pulled his flannel tighter across his chest and took a slow sip of his meal. The spoon clicked quietly against the ceramic, the only sound in the room save the hum of the radio murmuring about rain. He was about to rise and clean up when he heard it. 3 knocks. Not hurried, not panicked, just steady, like someone asking without quite knowing what they needed. John froze, spoon mid-air. No one knocked out here, not unless it was something real. He stood slowly, bones stiff from another long day, and walked to the door. The last light of dusk haloed the porch, where a woman stood with her arms wrapped tight around herself, a scarf barely clinging to her shoulders. Her breath fogged the air in sharp bursts. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her boots were dusted with the gravel from his long driveway. She looked like she had walked farther than she meant to and had nowhere else to go. "I'm sorry," she said, voice tight from the chill. "I didn't mean to bother you. My car. It broke down. I tried to call someone, but there's no service out here." John didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, really looked. She was too polished for this place, too clean around the edges, but her eyes were tired and her voice had a crack in it that money couldn't fake. "You'd better come in," he said, stepping back from the door, "before the cold decides to stay." The door shut with a quiet thud behind her, sealing the cold outside and wrapping the small farmhouse in its usual hush. She hesitated near the entryway, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her coat, like she wasn't sure whether to stand or sit or simply disappear. John walked past her without a word, heading back to the kitchen with the heavy, unbothered rhythm of someone who'd lived a long time without company and didn't find silence awkward. "You hungry?" he asked, already ladling the remainder of the stew into a second bowl. He didn't wait for her to answer. She was pale, wind-burned, and she looked like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in a while. He could see the tremble in her hands, even though she tried to keep them still. "A little," she admitted, her voice soft, almost embarrassed. "Well," he said, placing the steaming bowl down at the small table across from his own, "this ain't much, but it's hot. And it's got beans, so you'll survive." She gave a tired smile and sat, pulling the bowl toward her with both hands as if it were the most precious thing she'd touched all day. John took his seat opposite her and picked up his spoon like it was just another Tuesday night. No ceremony, no explanation. They ate in quiet spoonfuls, broken only by the occasional clink of metal on ceramic. The stew was thin but warm. His own version of comfort food, built from canned odds and ends, and the stubbornness to keep going. He didn't tell her it was his last, didn't mention the empty shelf or the unopened letter from the bank still tucked behind the sugar tin. It wasn't pity he was offering, just decency. She didn't say much, but he caught her watching him now and then, eyes tracing the cracked tile, the yellowed wallpaper, the worn grooves in the wooden table where years of use had shaped it like a river-carved stone. When she finished, she pushed her bowl forward gently and whispered, "Thank you." John just nodded and stood to collect the dishes. "Nobody should be cold and hungry at the same time," he said, "least of all in my kitchen." She stayed by the wood stove after dinner, both hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea he'd brewed from a dusty box of chamomile. She hadn't asked for it. He just set it down in front of her without saying much. That seemed to be their language so far. Fewer words. More quiet understanding. John leaned back in his chair, the old thing creaking beneath him, as he gazed into the flickering firelight. She hadn't taken off her coat, just unzipped it halfway, and let the warmth find its way in. Her eyes wandered around the room like they were trying to memorize it, as if it might disappear if she blinked too long. "You on your way to somewhere?" he asked finally, his voice low and easy. Her gaze shifted toward the window, where the last strands of twilight were giving in to the dark. "Sort of," she said. "I thought I was." He waited for more, but it didn't come. After a long pause, she added, "I'll head out in the morning. I just needed a moment to stop." John nodded. "You can take all the moments you need. The couch pulls out if you want a bed. It's not fancy, but it's clean." She looked at him then, really looked. "You're not going to ask who I am?" "Nope." "Why not?" He met her gaze evenly. "'Cause you're not ready to tell me. And I figure people say what they need to when they're good and ready." She seemed to study that answer, searching for the catch, but there wasn't one. Just a man with lines on his face and dirt under his nails, who'd learned a long time ago that people carried things they weren't always ready to name. "I'm Claire," she said quietly after a beat. Then, as if regretting it, added, "But just Claire." "All right then," John said, getting up to rinse the tea mugs. "Just Claire." He didn't ask anything else, and she didn't offer. But the silence between them wasn't empty, it was something like peace. Two people with jagged edges finding, if only for a night, a place where they didn't have to fit perfectly to be welcome. The hallway creaked under John's boots as he led her past the worn pictures on the wall, sepia-toned smiles, a young couple caught in some long-ago summer, sunburnt and laughing beside a rusted truck. He didn't explain who they were. She didn't ask. The house was old, but it held its memories gently, like a quilt folded over time. He stopped at the last door on the right and opened it slowly, as if still expecting something sacred on the other side. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, the kind of scent that lingers long after someone's gone. The bed was neatly made with a patchwork quilt in soft blues and faded reds, its edges hand-stitched with care. Dust shimmered in the soft lamplight, and a single rocking chair sat by the window, angled just so toward the fields. "No one's used this room in a while," he said, almost apologetically, rubbing the back of his neck. "But everything works. Sheets are clean, closet's empty. You can stay as long as you need." Claire stepped inside and took it in slowly. There were no signs of a rush, no signs of change, just a room waiting patiently, untouched by time. Her fingers brushed the quilt, the stitched rows and careful lines, and she felt the weight of someone else's love sewn into every corner. John lingered in the doorway. "My wife made that," he said quietly. "She had a thing about quilts, said every square told a story, never let a guest sleep without one." Claire looked up at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "I'm not a guest," she said, almost too soft to hear. He didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but you're here, and for now, that's enough." He turned to leave, hand on the doorframe. "Get some rest. We'll figure out tomorrow when it shows up." She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. So she nodded instead, pulling her coat tighter around her, then looser, unsure what to do with her hands. He closed the door gently behind her. Alone now, Claire sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. She didn't know if she'd earned this kindness, but she wasn't about to waste it. Morning came quietly, wrapped in the low hush of frost melting off the roof. The sky was a pale kind of blue, still undecided about the day. Claire found her way to the kitchen by the scent of coffee and the creak of old floorboards, barefoot and a little unsure, wrapped in a borrowed flannel shirt that hung from a hook by the door. John was already at the table, hands curled around a chipped mug, a second one, waiting without fanfare. He didn't say much when she entered, just slid the mug toward her and nodded toward the window. "Sun's up. I was about to head out." She followed him outside, the cold biting a little less than the night before. The fields stretched out before them, vast and quiet, rows of dark soil resting beneath the wide sky. No green yet, just the promise of it. The barn stood in the distance like a tired sentinel, and a soft breeze tugged at the cuffs of her sleeves. They walked side by side, boots pressing into the damp earth, breath fogging the air. Claire glanced around at the emptiness, then looked over at him. It all looked so still. John nodded. "It is, for now." She pointed toward a row of tilled soil, not yet seeded, not yet anything. "What are you planting?" He looked out at the land for a long moment before answering. "Hope." She raised an eyebrow, not mocking, just curious. He gave a small shrug, almost smiling. "Doesn't matter what crop it is if you don't believe it's going to grow. Corn, beans, squash. It's all just seeds and dirt without the right faith behind it. Every time I plant, I'm betting on the idea that something's going to break through the silence." Claire fell quiet again, eyes scanning the horizon. "It's strange," she finally said. "I used to think everything had to move fast to matter. Stocks, markets, headlines. But this takes time," John finished for her. "But it matters more." They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the stillness between the rows. And for the first time in a long time, Claire didn't feel like running. The sun had climbed a little higher, warming the morning chill into something almost gentle. John knelt near the far edge of the field, hands buried in the soil, moving with the rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to count. He didn't look up when he heard her footsteps crunching across the patchy grass, just shifted a little, leaving room. Claire crouched beside him, knees sinking into the damp earth. She hesitated for half a second before reaching out, fingers brushing the cold soil like she was touching something sacred. Her hands were too clean, her nails trimmed and polished, more used to glass screens than rough ground. But she didn't flinch. She didn't ask for gloves. She just started digging. John glanced over once, but said nothing. If she wanted to learn, he wouldn't stop her. The soil clung to her skin, dark and wet, slipping beneath her fingernails. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't pretty. But it felt real, like she was doing something that mattered in a way she hadn't in years. "This row's for sweet potatoes," John murmured. "Keep the spacing right, or they'll choke each other out." She nodded, mimicking his movements, hands shaky but determined. She didn't complain when a clump of clay stuck to her wrist, didn't flinch when her jeans stained brown from the knees down. She worked in silence, breath matching the pace of his, like they were falling into a rhythm not taught, but shared. "Harder than it looks," she said eventually, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "Most honest things are," he replied. She looked over at him, dirt streaking her cheek, and gave a half laugh, half sigh. "I used to make deals worth millions from behind a desk. Felt powerful, but I never felt like this." John didn't ask what this meant. He figured if she kept showing up with dirt on her hands, she'd figure it out for herself. And as they moved down the row, the sun warming their backs, something quiet passed between them, unspoken, steady, and growing right beneath the surface. The kitchen was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that settles in after a long day of labor, the kind where every muscle aches in the best way, and the smell of sweat and earth still lingers faintly beneath the scent of supper. John sat at the table alone, the light from the overhead bulb pooling around him like a spotlight, illuminating the stack of mail he hadn't touched all week. He thumbed through it slowly, methodically. Seed catalogs, a coupon flyer, a farm equipment ad, and then the envelope, white, crisp, unforgiving. The bank's logo in the corner like a brand. He didn't need to open it. He'd seen enough of them before. But he opened it anyway, unfolding the page with fingers that moved slower than they used to. Foreclosure proceedings, final notice, property auction pending. He read the words without really reading them, like someone revisiting a scar they already knew was there. His jaw tightened, but he didn't curse, didn't slam anything. Just folded it up, crisp as it had come, and slid it beneath the pile of seed catalogs on the counter. The catalogs had bright covers, sunflowers, squash, dreams for next season. Maybe next year wouldn't come, but hope was a habit, even when the math said otherwise. The screen door creaked open behind him. Claire stepped in, her hair damp from the shower, face flushed from the hot water and evening air. She wore the same flannel shirt she'd borrowed, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She looked freer somehow, like the soil had loosened something in her too. "What are you reading?" she asked, walking to the kettle. "Seed catalogs," he said, nodding toward the stack. She smiled. "Planning ahead?" "Always, va." He didn't lie. He just didn't tell her about the paper buried underneath. The date circled in red ink deep in his mind. There wasn't anything she could do, and he wasn't about to let her carry his burden. She was already carrying enough. So he watched her sip her tea, watched her settle into the old rocking chair, and reminded himself that not all things worth saving can be measured in acres or dollars. Some of them just sit across the room, quietly breathing, unaware that their presence feels like sunlight on a dying vine. The sun had barely crested the ridge when John stepped onto the porch, steam curling from the chipped mug in his hand. The wood beneath his boots groaned in that familiar forgiving way, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it always had, until he saw her. Claire was already in the field, her frame wrapped in one of his old jackets, sleeves rolled twice at the cuffs. She knelt near the back fence, where Winter had pulled the wire loose and the wood leaned like a tired old man. Her breath came in quick, visible puffs, but she worked with focus, her hands steady as she looped the fencing taut and hammered in a new post with the rhythm of someone who was trying to remember how to stay grounded. John watched her for a beat, then stepped down from the porch. "You know," he called out, his voice cutting through the cold, "most folks who find themselves stranded in the middle of nowhere don't spend the next morning fixing fences." Claire looked up, a strand of hair stuck to her cheek, smudged with sweat and soil. Most folks haven't been stranded somewhere that feels like it's worth staying. He didn't have a reply for that, just handed her the second mug of coffee he'd poured on instinct. They stood side by side, looking over the frosty land as the sun began to chase the cold from the ground. She sipped her coffee like it was new to her, like she was learning to taste something other than tension for the first time in a long while. So she said after a while, "How do you decide what to plant in which rows?" He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You thinking of going into farming now?" "Maybe I already have," she said, smirking over the rim of her mug. He started explaining about soil types, about last year's drought, about the way certain crops played better together like old friends, and she listened like it mattered, like the story of the earth was just as riveting as boardrooms and market trends. And every morning after that, she was still there, wrapped in borrowed flannel, asking questions about rainfall, compost, pollinators, piecing herself back together between rows of dirt and sky like she'd always belonged. The house had gone quiet, the kind of deep hush that only came when the last light was out, and even the walls seemed to exhale. John had gone to bed hours ago, his familiar footsteps retreating down the hall, the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind him like punctuation on the day. Claire waited a while longer, sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of cold tea she'd forgotten to drink. The need to call had been building in her like pressure in a sealed jar, slow, steady, impossible to ignore. So she grabbed her coat from the hook, wrapped it tight around her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air bit at her skin. Above her, the stars hung low and heavy, unmarred by city glare. It made her feel both small and safe, like something ancient was watching. She pulled the phone from her pocket and stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the contact for a long second. Then she tapped it. The line rang once, twice, then a voice, sharp, alert, familiar. "Claire?" She closed her eyes. "Yeah, it's me." A pause, then, "Where the hell have you been?" Claire took a slow breath. "I needed time." "You can't just disappear. The board's been calling. There's press sniffing around. We thought—" "I'm okay," she interrupted, softer this time. "I'm somewhere safe." "Where?" She looked out toward the fields, the rows now hidden under darkness, but still etched in her mind like lines on a palm. "Somewhere honest." Another silence, less angry now, more wary. "Are you coming back?" She hesitated, tightening the coat around her like armor. "I found it," she whispered. "What?" "What I was looking for. I'm not ready to come back." There was no reply, only static and breath. Claire glanced through the kitchen window. The light over the sink had been left on, casting a warm glow across the counter. She imagined John asleep in the next room, unaware that his quiet kindness had shifted something tectonic in her. "I'll call again," she said, and hung up before they could ask anything else. Then she stepped back into the farmhouse, where the world moved slower, but somehow felt more alive. By the third week, the town had begun to notice. You couldn't hide much in a place like Fairhill, not new tractors, not old debts, and definitely not a strange woman mending fences beside John Carter. She was seen at the feed store once, flipping through seed packets with dirt still under her nails, and a softness behind her eyes that didn't match the sharp lines of her cheekbones. Folks glanced, nodded politely, then whispered after she left. The cashier, old Doris Merton, muttered to a customer, "Too polished to be one of us." The man behind her in line just shrugged and said, "Maybe John finally hired help." At Millie's diner, where biscuits came with a side of gossip, theories bloomed like weeds. She's a health inspector. No, she's one of those trust fund dropouts trying to go off grid. She's probably his cousin from the city, lost her job. Divorce, maybe. One woman leaned over her coffee and whispered, "I heard she paid cash at the hardware store. Who carries that much?" But the only one who didn't speculate was John. He just kept working, sunrise to sundown, boots caked with mud, hands steady on the plow. If folks asked about the woman, he'd give the same answer every time. She's helping out, that's all. And help she did. She patched chicken wire without being asked, weeded garden beds before breakfast, and even started remembering which rows needed extra watering and which ones the rabbits liked to sneak into. She'd started keeping a notebook in her coat pocket, jotting things down like she wanted to earn her place inch by inch. One afternoon at the gas station, Claire stepped out of John's truck to grab a bag of feed. A couple of old-timers leaned against the ice machine, watching. "She doesn't belong here," one muttered. The other spat into the gravel. "Maybe, but she looks like she wants to." Claire pretended not to hear, but later that night she lingered in the barn longer than usual, hands pressed against the warm flank of the old milk cow, forehead resting quietly against its side, listening to the steady rhythm of something that didn't care who she was, only how gently she showed up. The stand was nothing fancy, just a few planks of salvaged wood nailed together with more heart than precision, a hand-painted sign that read, "Carter Farm Produce," in crooked red letters, and a worn umbrella to block the worst of the sun. It sat right at the edge of the gravel road, where passing trucks kicked up dust and curious drivers slowed to take a peek. Claire had the idea. John had the lumber. And together they built it on a Sunday morning, while the church bells rang faintly in the distance. The tomatoes came first, fat, sun-warmed, and stubbornly red despite the dry season. They filled old wooden crates with them, arranging them like jewels in the soft glow of mid-morning. Claire wiped one clean with the hem of her shirt, holding it up like it was the finest thing she'd ever seen. "I used to spend $50 on heirlooms that didn't look this good." John snorted. "City people will pay anything if you call it artisanal." She laughed, and he did too, low and quiet, like his ribs hadn't quite remembered how. They added cucumbers, a few squash, and a jar of pickled beets that John claimed hadn't killed anyone yet. Claire scribbled prices on a chalkboard in loopy cursive and insisted on tying twine around the paper bags for a homegrown touch. It was the most time she'd spent playing in years. Customers came slow at first, a young couple on a motorcycle, an old man with a dusty hat and $2 in change. Then a woman from town recognized Claire, narrowed her eyes, and said nothing, but still bought a pint of cherry tomatoes. They didn't make much, maybe $20 by noon. But they stayed all afternoon anyway, feet kicked up on a crate, sipping sweet tea from mason jars and swapping stories. Claire told him about her grandmother's garden in Vermont. John told her about the time his wife tried to plant watermelon and ended up with a gopher nest instead. And for a while, as the sun dipped behind the barn and the last light painted everything gold, it wasn't about money or futures or the weight of unspoken things. It was just two people beside a roadside stand, laughing like they'd forgotten the world expected anything more. The attic wasn't a place Claire had meant to go. She was looking for spare jars for pickling. John had mentioned a box up there somewhere, and curiosity got the better of her. The stairs groaned beneath her weight, the air growing heavier with dust and memory as she climbed. The hatch creaked open, spilling dim light into a space lined with cobwebs and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. The attic was organized the way someone with a careful heart might leave things: labeled boxes, an old cedar chest, a rocking chair draped in a faded quilt. She moved slowly, respectful of the silence, her fingertips grazing over forgotten items as if asking permission to be there. Then she saw it, a leather-bound journal worn smooth at the corners, sitting atop a box labeled Maggie's Things. Claire picked it up gently, brushing off a layer of dust. The name on the inside cover was written in tidy script, Margaret Carter, with a small heart doodled beside it. She hesitated, then opened to the first page. March 18th. The cherry tree bloomed early this year. I took it as a sign to plant kindness. Claire turned the pages slowly, each one a quiet window into a woman she'd never met but already admired. Sketches of chickens, notes about peach trees, ideas for a roadside produce market with picnic benches for tired travelers. There were lists of people to help. Widow Johnson needs someone to patch her fence. Build a ramp for Carl's porch. Offer free eggs to the school canteen. Each dream scribbled with a kind of hopeful urgency, like Maggie had been racing time to leave love behind in tangible ways. One page held Claire still. One day I want to build a small orchard, and maybe a place where people can come when they feel lost, a place to heal, a place to remember that the world isn't always loud and cruel. Claire pressed her palm flat against the paper as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She didn't sob. She didn't break. She just sat there in the attic's hush, surrounded by someone else's dreams, realizing they were the same ones she never let herself admit she had. Downstairs, the floor creaked with John's footsteps. She didn't move. For now she needed this moment, just her, the journal, and the woman who had once believed that a simple farm could be a sanctuary. The moonlight slipped in through the lace curtains, casting long silver stripes across the quilt on her bed. Claire lay awake, one arm behind her head, the other resting lightly on the leather journal she hadn't let go of since the attic. The house was quiet, peaceful, honest in the way few places ever were. But she wasn't. Claire Whitmore, daughter of Grant Whitmore, the man who turned nothing into billions with nothing more than charm and cutthroat deals. Her face had graced business magazines, her name linked to mergers and IPOs and whispered boardroom takeovers. At 32, she was chair of one of the largest investment firms in the country. Whitmore Equity didn't just move markets, it dictated them. And no one here had a clue. In Fairhill, she was just the woman on John Carter's farm. No last name, no headlines, no polished press releases. Just Claire, the one who sold tomatoes and drank too much sweet tea, the one who now knew how to wrangle fence wire and how it felt to fall asleep without dreading the next day's calendar. But the truth pressed against her ribs like a weight she couldn't keep balancing. Her phone, silent on the nightstand, held dozens of missed calls. Her assistant, her brother, her lawyer. And today, she'd seen her own name scroll across the bottom of a TV in the corner of the diner. Claire Whitmore missing? They weren't wrong. She was missing, not from danger, from expectation. She rolled onto her side and stared at the moonlight. She hadn't told John, not because she didn't trust him, but because she did. He treated her like a person, not a profile. He handed her coffee, not questions. And that made it harder. Out there she was Claire Whitmore, investment queen, every move calculated and broadcast. But here, with dirt under her nails and Maggie Carter's dreams whispering from the attic, she was something she hadn't been in years. She was becoming real. And she didn't know how much longer she could hold the two selves apart. But tonight, just for tonight, she clung to the version that laughed at a roadside stand and cried in a quiet attic, the one John saw, the one who didn't need to explain her name. The sky was unforgiving that day, an unfiltered blue with a punishing sun that made the fields shimmer with heat. Dust clung to everything, skin, clothes, lungs. John had been at it since dawn, coaxing the old red tractor through row after stubborn row, the harvest just barely on schedule. The corn was temperamental this season, some too dry, some too green, but he couldn't afford to wait. Not with the bank circling, not with winter coming. Claire had brought water in a mason jar, the ice long since melted. She set it on the fence post and gave him a smile he didn't return. That's when it happened. A sputter, a cough, then silence. The engine died like it had taken its last breath. And John didn't even curse. He just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead like if he stayed still enough, maybe the thing would rethink dying. But it didn't. Claire walked over slowly. He'd climbed down by then, sitting on the wheel well, head bowed, fingers laced behind his neck, sweat soaked through his shirt, not just from heat, but from pressure, exhaustion, defeat. The kind that comes when a man's already holding the weight of a world too big for one back. "It's gone," he said flatly, not looking at her. "Transmission's shot. I've rebuilt it twice already. Won't crank again without a miracle." She crouched beside him, not speaking at first, just sat there in the dirt while the cicadas buzzed and the breeze stirred the corn like a soft apology. Then quietly she stood and stepped a few paces away, pulling her phone from her back pocket. For a moment she stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. Then she made the call. "I need a Massey Ferguson 5700 delivered to Fairhill. New or gently used, fully functional. I'll wire the funds now," she said, her voice calm and clipped, like a switch had been flipped. A part of her she hadn't touched in weeks. "Deliver it to Carter Farm. No paperwork at the door." The voice on the other end barely had time to respond before she hung up. When she turned back, John hadn't moved. She didn't say a word, just sat beside him again. He never asked what the call was about, and she didn't offer. It showed up just after breakfast. The morning mist hadn't even lifted from the fields when the rumble of a diesel engine echoed up the long gravel drive. John stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, squinting into the rising sun. A flatbed truck pulled up slow, hauling something big, gleaming, and utterly out of place. A brand-new Massey Ferguson tractor, red, spotless, tires thick with factory tread. The kind of machine most farmers in Fairhill only saw in catalogs. The kind John had circled a dozen times and then folded the page closed. The delivery guy hopped down from the cab, clipboard in hand, grin too wide for 8 a.m. "Delivery for Carter Farm?" John blinked. "You sure you got the right place?" The guy glanced at his paper. "Paid in full, no return address listed, just said it was for you." He looked over the porch railing at the woman stepping out of the house, pulling her sleeves over her wrists. "She's with you?" John nodded slowly, still staring at the machine like it might vanish if he looked away. The delivery man tipped his cap, unloaded the tractor, and was gone before John could form another question. Claire joined him at the porch steps, hands tucked in her coat pockets. John didn't speak for a while, just walked a slow, quiet circle around the tractor, trailing his hand along the metal like it might burn him. Then he turned toward her, jaw set, eyes sharp in that way he reserved for broken fences and unwanted news. "I didn't order this," he said. Claire tilted her head, feigning innocence poorly. "Didn't you?" He gave a small shake of his head. "You know I didn't." She shrugged. "Maybe the universe pays attention. Maybe it knew you were due a little grace." Claire. She held his gaze, steady. "Call it a gift or call it luck. But maybe, just maybe, you don't always have to lose something to deserve something." He didn't argue, didn't thank her either. Just turned back to the tractor, jaw working, emotion flickering behind the silence. He'd never had anything fall from the sky before, but today, something had. And deep down, he suspected it didn't come from the universe. It came from the woman who still wouldn't say who she really was. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and roasted carrots, the kind of scent that made the house feel warmer than it really was. Claire had insisted on cooking that night, claiming she owed him for at least a dozen breakfasts and 24 buckets of sweat. John let her. She moved through the kitchen like she was trying to prove something, not just with the food, but with her presence. Like if she stirred just right, or chopped with enough care, she could keep the truth from boiling over. They sat across from each other at the small table, the mismatched plates filled with roasted vegetables, cornbread, and a simple stew. The lamplight threw soft shadows on the walls, and outside the night hummed with the rhythm of crickets and quiet wind. John ate slowly, as he always did, methodical in a way that said he never took food for granted. Claire picked at her cornbread, chewing more than she spoke. The silence between them was different tonight, not easy, not comfortable, but tight at the edges, like something waiting to snap. After a while he set down his fork and looked at her, not just with curiosity, but with a quiet sort of weight. "So," he said, voice low, "you gonna tell me who you really are?" Claire's hand froze mid-reach for her glass. She forced a smile. "I told you. Just Claire. Claire who can order a brand new tractor with a phone call and no paperwork." She met his eyes, the smile fading. "I was just trying to help." He didn't look angry, just changed. A stillness in his face that wasn't there before, a little colder around the edges. "I didn't ask for help," he said, not unkindly, just truthfully. "I know." Silence fell again, longer this time. She looked down at her plate, then out the window, as if something out there might rescue her from the moment. John nodded slowly and went back to his meal. He didn't ask again. But he didn't laugh the rest of the night, not even when she tried. And that was worse than anger, because it meant something between them had shifted, quietly, like a fence wire pulled too tight, waiting to snap if pulled again. The rain came sudden and hard, slapping against the roof like it had something to say. Thunder rolled across the hills deep and angry, shaking the window panes in their frames. The storm had crept in from the west just after supper, chasing them indoors before they could finish covering the last rows. Now the fields outside were rivers of mud, and the wind bent the trees like they owed it something. John stood by the window, watching it all with that quiet stillness he wore like a second skin. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped around herself, the flickering light from the old lamp casting her face in half-shadow. She had been holding it in for too long. "I should have told you," she said softly, her voice nearly drowned out by the storm. "But I didn't know how." John didn't turn, didn't move, just listened. "My name is Claire Whitmore." The words felt heavier than thunder. "My family owns Whitmore Equity. We're the reason half of downtowns get bought and gutted. I'm the face they use when they want to soften the blow." She glanced at him, but he didn't flinch. "I left because I couldn't breathe anymore. Boardrooms, interviews, shareholders. I was drowning in a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow on the inside." Lightning cracked and the room lit up for a heartbeat before going dim again. "I drove without a map, without a plan. I didn't even mean to stop here, but my car broke down, and you—" She swallowed hard. "You shared your last meal with me. You didn't ask questions. You didn't want anything, and that felt like the first honest thing I'd been given in years." She paused, the storm filling in her silence. Her hands were trembling now. "I didn't buy that tractor to impress you. I couldn't watch you lose something else. I know what that feels like." John finally turned, slowly. His eyes met hers, not with judgment, not with awe, just the same even, quiet gaze he always gave her. He walked over, sat down beside her, and didn't say a word. He just listened, like he understood that sometimes the most generous thing a person can give is their silence. The morning after the storm broke clean and bright, the kind of sky that made everything look like it had been freshly scrubbed. The gravel road steamed from the sun, and puddles shimmered like pieces of broken glass tossed across the dirt. John stood by the truck, keys in hand, when Claire came out of the house wearing his old denim jacket and boots 2 sizes too big. "Town run?" she asked, pretending it was a normal day. He just nodded, motioning for her to hop in. The drive into Fairhill was quiet, but not cold. The air between them felt lighter, not because everything had been said, but because she had finally let something true come to the surface. And he hadn't sent her away. That, in its own quiet way, was enough for now. They parked near the feed store, the familiar clang of the bell above the door greeting them as they stepped inside. It didn't take long for heads to turn. First Doris at the register raised her eyebrows. Then Tom Jackson did a double-take from behind a stack of hay bales. Whispers stirred like dust, soft and swirling. John didn't flinch. He just grabbed a sack of feed and nodded toward Claire, who was already drifting through the rows of seed packets like they were treasure maps. She bought 3 kinds of heirloom tomatoes, sweet corn, carrots, and a wildflower mix. She asked about chicken feed, cracked a joke about runaway goats to the clerk, and paid in cash. Then she crossed the street to Millie's Bakery and bought a peach pie warm from the oven, cradling it in both arms like it was made of gold. Outside, people watched, not rudely, just curiously. Claire could feel it in the way conversations paused when she passed, in the way someone whispered, "Is that her?" as she handed John a paper bag of cinnamon rolls. But no one said a word to her directly, not yet. They walked back to the truck side by side, dust rising around their boots, arms brushing now and then like it meant nothing, but also everything. No one in town knew what was coming, not the bank, not the board, not even John, but Claire did. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from something. She was walking toward it. The envelope was thicker this time. It came with a knock, not the usual quiet thud in the mailbox, and when John opened the door, he found a man in a gray suit standing on the porch, polished shoes, clipboard in hand, smile too tight to be kind. "Mr. Carter," the man said, offering the envelope like it was just paperwork, not a sentence. "I'm here on behalf of First AgriBank." John didn't take it right away. He looked at the man, then the seal, then the truck parked at the edge of his drive, engine running, like even the banker didn't want to linger. "It's official now?" John asked, voice like dry gravel. "Yes, sir, you've got 30 days. The man hesitated, as if something about John's quiet was heavier than the papers in his hand. Then he turned and left without another word. John stood on the porch, staring down at the envelope in his hands, the morning sun warming everything but him. Claire found him there 10 minutes later, still unmoving. "Is that it?" she asked. He nodded. 30 days. She stepped closer, reading the look on his face before she even saw the envelope. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head slowly. "I knew it was coming. I just didn't think it'd land on a day that started with cinnamon rolls." Claire tried to smile, failed. He didn't rage, didn't crumble. He just folded the envelope once, carefully, like a man who'd learned how to carry bad news with dignity. "I'm not asking for pity," he said quietly. "You're not getting pity," Claire said. "You're getting help." John turned to her, eyes tired but clear. "Claire, I can't let you—" She stepped forward, voice firmer than he'd ever heard it. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Just don't give up. Not yet." He looked at her for a long time, like he was trying to read through a fog. Then he nodded once, the smallest movement, but enough. And she exhaled, silently promising herself that if the system was going to take this place from him, it would have to go through her first. The sound came low at first, like a distant hum beneath the chirping of morning birds. John was hauling water from the well, boots muddy from yesterday's storm, when the rumble thickened into a throb that shook the fence posts. He looked up, squinting into the early light, and saw the outline, a sleek black helicopter slicing through the blue, too smooth, too fast, too out of place for a farm that still relied on hand tools and prayer. Claire was already on the porch, her hair tied back, her coat still open. She didn't look surprised. The chopper circled once before lowering toward the hill behind the barn, blades whipping the grass into chaos. John shielded his face from the wind, watching as the door slid open and a figure stepped out, a young woman in sharp heels, dark slacks, and an expression like she belonged anywhere but here. "Claire Whitmore," she called out above the noise, clutching a tablet to her chest. "We brought everything you asked for." John turned to Claire slowly. Her face was calm, not ashamed, not afraid, just steady, like the moment she'd stopped pretending had finally arrived. "I told you not to give up," she said. "You didn't say anything about helicopters," he muttered. The assistant approached, careful of the mud, handing Claire the tablet. Claire tapped through screens with the ease of someone who hadn't forgotten how power worked. She'd just chosen not to use it until now. "Property listings, deeds, contracts," the assistant rattled off. "All of them. Every foreclosure in the county marked for immediate acquisition. We've got legal on standby and a trust pre-registered in the Carter name." John blinked. "Wait, what?" Claire didn't look at him yet. She was signing documents, flipping screens, moving at a speed this land hadn't seen in decades. "You're not just keeping your farm, John. We're buying back everything they were ready to take." He stood there in the wind and engine roar, his coat flapping, his breath lost somewhere between disbelief and awe. Claire finally met his eyes. "I'm not just buying time," she said. "I'm buying it all back. For you, for this town, for everyone who's been told they're too small to matter." And in that moment, under the spinning blades and rising sun, John Carter realized he'd let a woman into his home who didn't just plant hope, she harvested redemption. The county clerk's office had never seen a morning like this. It smelled faintly of old carpet and fresh coffee, same as it always had, with a dusty ceiling fan spinning above stacks of paper that hadn't been moved in years. But something was different. The woman behind the counter, Marlene, 62, glasses always on the tip of her nose, watched with widening eyes as folder after folder was spread across the desk in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, adjusting her bifocals. "You want to do what now?" Claire stood tall, tablet in hand, her tone calm but unwavering. "I'm purchasing every active foreclosure within a 30-mile radius of Carter Farm. Full price. No negotiations." Marlene blinked. "That's over 40 properties." 42, Claire corrected, sliding a list forward with tidy annotations beside each parcel number. "And I want each deed transferred immediately into a community trust. Beneficiary, John Carter." Marlene looked like someone had just dropped a live chicken on her desk. "You can't," she stammered. "I mean, yes, you can. But why?" Claire offered a faint smile. "Because this land belongs to people who never stopped fighting for it, and because men like John Carter don't come around often. It's time the system served them for once." By the time noon hit, the phones were buzzing. Attorneys were looped in. Paperwork printed faster than the ancient copier could handle. Marlene had enlisted both interns, the town historian and the zoning officer, just to keep up. And John didn't know yet. He was still out on the land, hammering a fence post into frozen ground, unaware that property lines were shifting in his name like dominoes, tipping back toward justice. When the last signature was inked and the final deed transferred, Marlene looked up from the stack and exhaled. "I've been here 30 years, she said. "Ain't never seen anything like this." Claire gathered the papers into a single folder. "Good. Maybe it's time folks around here start seeing things they've never seen before." Then she left the office quietly, a storm of change in borrowed boots, walking back to the farm that was no longer just John's, but now, in the eyes of the law, a legacy. By the end of the week, the town had more theories than stop signs. The news moved like wind through wheat, fast, invisible, and impossible to pin down. One morning, the diner chalkboard read, "Pie of the day, Whitmore apple." And by noon, the name Claire Whitmore was being whispered in grocery aisles, passed between gas station pumps, muttered over church bulletins and feed bags. "She bought half the county," someone said. "She's laundering money," said someone else. "I heard she's CIA." "No, she's royalty. Russian, probably." "She's just lonely." Millie from the bakery called it a miracle. Tom from the hardware store called it suspicious. And old Ed Rollins, who hadn't trusted a stranger since Nixon, muttered something about it all being too good to be true. But through all the noise, no one could agree on the most important part. Why? Because Claire didn't give speeches. She didn't take interviews. She didn't hold court. She went right back to the farm, right back to weeding rows and fixing fences, wearing the same flannel shirts and muddy boots. She still showed up at the feed store and bought coffee at the co-op. She still laughed with Doris at the checkout counter and asked about local beekeepers. She didn't act like someone who'd dropped millions into a forgotten town. And that, more than anything, made people uncertain. As for John, he kept his head down, didn't defend her, didn't explain her, just nodded at the stairs, tipped his hat like always, and kept loading hay. Folks asked him questions sideways, hoping he'd slip. He never did. What they didn't see, what they couldn't know, was what John had given her. Not money, not land, not even forgiveness. He had given her a meal when she had nothing to offer. He had given her silence when she needed to break. He had given her a place to become someone new without asking why she needed it. And in a world where everything had a price, he had given her something priceless, the chance to stop running. The town saw her power, but only John had seen her broken, and only he understood that what she was building wasn't just restitution, it was redemption, one row, one deed, one quiet morning at a time. The paper hit doorsteps on a quiet Wednesday morning, folded like always, smudged with ink and the scent of coffee. Most folks in Fairhill still read it cover to cover, more out of habit than need, so when they turned to page 3 and saw the bold header, "An open letter to Fairhill," they paused. Some read standing over the kitchen sink, toast in hand. Others read aloud at the diner, voices softening as they reached the end. The letter wasn't long, it didn't need to be. To the people of Fairhill, I came here by accident, lost, tired, and frozen to the bone. My car broke down on a quiet road. I knocked on the door of a man I didn't know, and he opened it. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't care about my name or what I had. He split his last bowl of stew with me. He gave me shelter without expectation. He offered kindness in a world that often forgets how. That man was John Carter. Some of you are asking why I did what I did, why I bought land, why I signed papers, why I gave things away that others worked their whole lives to earn. The answer is simple. I'm not giving charity. I'm returning something the world took. John shared his last meal with me when he had nothing. He reminded me what it means to live simply, honestly, with grit and grace. This town, the people in it, you're not broken. You're just forgotten. And maybe it's time someone remembered. What I've done isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of one that doesn't have my name on the cover, but yours. Claire Whitmore. By lunch, the phone at the paper hadn't stopped ringing. Some called to say thank you. Some called to say it was a stunt. Others cried quietly on the line and just hung up. But the one thing everyone felt, whether they admitted it or not, was that something had shifted. Not just in land deeds and property lines, but in the idea that maybe, just maybe, goodness could still echo louder than greed. And it had all started with a bowl of stew. The sun was low when John found her by the garden, crouched over the wildflowers she'd scattered weeks ago. They were starting to bloom, bright pops of yellow and purple reaching up like they had something to prove. She was watering them gently, lost in the rhythm of it, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from its tie. He didn't call her name, just stood a moment behind her, watching. Then he cleared his throat, gravel thick in his voice. "We need to talk." Claire looked up, eyes soft but wary. She set the tin watering can aside and stood, brushing dirt from her hands. He didn't beat around it. John never did. "I never asked for any of this." She didn't speak. The land, the trust, the newspaper letter, the tractor, hell, even the pie, he added, but his voice cracked slightly at the end. "I know," she said gently. "I didn't want saving." "I didn't come to save you," she replied, stepping closer. "I came here a mess. And you didn't ask who I was. You didn't try to fix me. You just gave me a meal, a warm place to sleep, and the space to remember who I was under all the noise." He shook his head, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I don't want people looking at me like I'm some saint." "They're not," she said. "They're looking at a man who stayed honest when he had every reason not to." "I don't need a legacy," he muttered. "I just need enough to get by." She smiled then, not wide, but real. "Exactly, and that's why you deserve more." He looked at her, silence stretching long between them, until he finally exhaled, slow and tired. "You sure about this?" Claire nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." He studied her for a long second, then looked past her, out at the field glowing gold in the dusk. The land was still his, but now it felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just shared. And maybe that was the point. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. They just stood there, side by side, letting the flowers bloom between them. It started with an old drawing Claire found tucked inside Maggie's journal, sketched in pencil, edges smudged, the lines soft but full of quiet hope. A simple greenhouse, framed by climbing roses, sunlight pouring through tall panes, with rows of herbs and vegetables tucked inside like a secret garden. Above the drawing, in Maggie's neat handwriting, one day, a place where things grow, even in winter. Claire had stared at it for a long time before bringing it to John, laying it on the kitchen table like an offering. "I want to build it," she said. "For her. For you." He didn't answer right away, just traced a fingertip over the curling vines she'd drawn around the door. Then, with a quiet nod, he said, "She would have liked that." They broke ground in early autumn. The air had turned crisp, the leaves just starting to burn gold at the edges. Neighbors came by to help, some out of curiosity, some because they'd read the letter in the paper and decided they wanted to be part of something that felt bigger than gossip. Wood was hauled, glass delivered. Claire worked every day, hammer in hand, face smudged with dust and sun. John taught her how to brace a frame. She taught him how to order materials without waiting 6 weeks. By the time the first frost threatened the soil, the greenhouse stood complete, modest in size, but glowing in the pale morning light. Inside, they filled it with rosemary, mint, basil, and Maggie's favorite, lavender. Tomato vines crept up trellises. Clay pots lined the shelves, already sprouting green. At the far end, just above the potting table, hung a small wooden plaque, carved by hand, painted simply. It read, "For the woman who believed in growing things." John stood beneath it the first time he stepped inside alone. He touched the plaque once, fingertips resting gently against the wood, like he was saying something without needing to say it out loud. Outside, Claire waited, giving him the space he never asked for, but always deserved. And in the quiet warmth of that glass house, something bloomed that wasn't just rooted in soil, but in memory, in love, and in everything they thought they'd lost, but were just beginning to find again. The idea came to Claire one afternoon as she watched a teenager struggle to lift a bag of feed at the co-op. Skinny arms, worn-out boots, too much weight on his back for someone that young. He reminded her of every kid who never got a fair shot, of every grown man who never learned to ask for one. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the greenhouse, she brought it up to John. "A place where people can come learn," she said, "not just how to plant a tomato, but how to rebuild a life." John leaned on the porch rail, staring out at the fields. "That's a tall order. You once gave a stranger stew and shelter without blinking. I figure tall orders are kind of your thing." He smiled, just barely. "You really think this town needs a school?" Claire nodded. "I think the world does." And so it began. They converted the old Miller barn on the edge of town, abandoned for years, ivy swallowing its sides, into something new. Contractors were called, plans drawn, volunteers gathered. Claire covered the costs quietly, the same way she always did. No press, no ribbon cutting, just work. The sign went up on a bright spring morning, hand-painted and hung above the wide double doors, the Margaret Carter Center for Growing and Grace. Inside, there were classrooms that smelled of cedar and compost, raised garden beds, a lending library filled with books on soil health, meditation, and starting over, a kitchen where people could learn to cook what they grew, a nursery full of tiny green things waiting to be planted. They offered courses in sustainable farming, mental health support, basic finance, tools for living, not just surviving. And people came, single parents, veterans, kids who'd dropped out, grandmothers who'd never touched a garden but wanted to try. At the opening, Claire stood in the back while John gave a short, quiet speech about hope, resilience, and the woman who once dreamed of a greenhouse. His voice cracked only once, when he said her name. And later, as the first seedlings were planted, Claire stood alone near the lavender and whispered, "She believed in growing things. Now they'll grow in her name." And they did. The morning was too quiet. The kettle hadn't whistled. The old radio wasn't humming its usual scratchy tune. And when John stepped into the kitchen, the table was bare. No coffee mugs, no scattered notes, no Claire. He found her by the front door, duffel bag at her feet, coat already on. Her hands trembled slightly as she zipped the last pocket, the movement practiced and slow, like she'd been rehearsing this goodbye in her head for days. "I didn't want to leave like this," she said without turning around. John didn't speak at first. He just looked at the bag, then at her, then at the space between them that had grown quieter in recent days. She finally met his eyes. "I never meant to stay this long, and I definitely didn't mean to take over your life." "You didn't," he said simply. Claire gave a small, broken laugh. "Come on, John. I bought the town. I put your name on things you didn't ask for. I stood in your kitchen and rewrote your story." He stepped closer, voice low and steady. "You didn't rewrite it. You just added a chapter." She looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm scared I'm ruining the piece you spent years building." John exhaled, slow and deliberate. Then he bent down, picked up the duffel bag, and walked it out the front door. Claire followed, silent. At the gate, he stopped. The sun was just rising, casting long golden lines across the dirt road and fields beyond. He set the bag down gently, then turned to her. "I built this life on quiet," he said, "but quiet isn't the same as peace." She blinked at him, the morning breeze catching her hair, her coat collar pulled high against the chill. "You didn't take anything from me, Claire. You gave me something back. Laughter, company, color." Her voice cracked. "Then why does it feel like I don't belong?" He stepped closer, calloused hand brushing against hers. "You belong because you're here, and I'm asking you to stay." Claire looked down at the bag, then back at him, and she didn't answer with words. She just reached for his hand. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the garden in golden light that made everything shimmer, petals, vines, even the air itself. The sunflowers stood tall like silent witnesses, their wide faces turned toward the last stretch of daylight. Tomatoes clung heavy on the vine, red and warm, ripening in the quiet hush that only late summer could bring. Claire walked the rows barefoot, dirt soft beneath her feet, dress hem brushing against the leaves. She didn't know why John had asked her to meet him there, only that his voice had held something different when he said it, something quieter than usual, but more certain too. She found him kneeling in the soil, hands deep in the ground, planting something, not with urgency, but with care. When he stood, there was dirt on his shirt and a smudge on his cheek. He looked like the man she met on that first freezing day, and yet nothing like him at all. "You building something?" she asked, smiling. He nodded and motioned to a small wooden sign staked into the earth. She stepped closer. The sign read, simply, "Ours." Claire blinked, the word catching in her chest. John cleared his throat. "That's a new plot. Haven't planted anything in it yet. Figured maybe we could decide together." She knelt beside the sign, fingers grazing the lettering. "What would we grow?" He shrugged. "Whatever makes you want to stay." Claire looked up at him, eyes glassy with something she wasn't ready to name. "I don't have a ring," he said softly. "Never really thought I'd ask anyone again. But I have this land, this life, and I'd like to share it with you. Not just the rows and the fences, all of it." She didn't speak, just stood, closed the space between them, and rested her forehead gently against his. "I never needed a ring," she whispered. "Just a place I didn't want to leave." They stood like that for a long time, sun setting behind them, roots settling beneath them. And somewhere in the soil, in that small square of earth marked ours, something began to grow. By the time the banners went up, word had already spread. The first ever Whitmore Carter Harvest Fair was happening on Saturday, and everyone was invited. They cleared the north field for it, where the soil had once been too poor to grow much of anything, but now held rows of booths, hay bales, and picnic tables covered in homemade tablecloths. The greenhouse sparkled behind them like a beacon, its windows thrown open to the scent of herbs and late-season blooms. John had been up since dawn hauling benches and lining the driveway with pumpkins. Claire made signs in her best cursive and organized a pie contest she had no intention of winning, though Millie from the bakery teased her all morning, vowing a cinnamon crumble takedown. By noon the town showed up, not in trickles but waves. Children darted between chickens and goats in the petting pen, cheeks sticky from caramel apples and kettle corn. High schoolers volunteered at the lemonade stand, while retirees told stories on folding chairs, gesturing with iced tea and half-finished sentences. There was live music, banjo and fiddle, the kind that made people forget what time it was, and there was laughter, real laughter. From the people who once whispered at the diner, the ones who'd questioned Claire, questioned John, questioned the change. Now they cheered. Old Ed Rollins brought a dozen jars of his infamous pickled green beans. Marlene from the clerk's office set up a seed exchange. Tom donated wood for the bonfire. Even Doris, who'd never been seen outside church or the register, entered her apple tart and hugged Claire with both arms. At the heart of it all, Claire and John moved together like they'd always done this, sharing bites of pie, pouring cider, accepting hugs from people who once kept their distance. When dusk came and the fairy lights blinked on along the fence posts, John looked out at the crowd and then at Claire. "You see this?" he murmured. She nodded, her eyes shining. "This is what you built," he said. She leaned in, voice low. "No, this is what we planted." And for the first time, the town didn't just celebrate a harvest. They celebrated a beginning. The seed catalogs went out every spring, stapled, dog-eared, filled with promises of what could bloom if you just gave the earth a little faith. But this year, tucked inside the front cover of the Hope County Grower's Guide, was something no one expected. A letter, printed on soft cream paper, folded neatly, no title. Just a handwritten line at the bottom, from Claire Whitmore, Carter Farm. It read, "If you're holding this catalog, maybe you're planting a garden. Maybe you're just flipping through, dreaming about rows of basil and summer squash. Or maybe, like I was not long ago, you're searching for something else entirely. I arrived in Hope County by accident. My car broke down, my plans fell apart. My heart was tired in a way I didn't know how to fix. And then I met a man who offered me a meal when he barely had enough for himself. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't need to. He saw a person before he saw a story. I stayed. I planted things. I watched the seasons change from the inside out. And in the process, I learned something simple and astonishing. Kindness is not a resource. It doesn't run out. It grows quietly in the hands of people who still believe in second chances. So if you're reading this and you feel lost, if the world's been unkind, if your soil's too dry, your roots too brittle, your hope too small, know this: there's a farm in Hope County where people still believe in the slow, sacred work of growing things. And you are always welcome here. Claire. By the time planting season rolled around, letters came from all over. Some handwritten, some typed, some scribbled on napkins. People asked for seeds, for advice, for directions. Some just wrote to say they cried reading it. John read every single one, and in the corner of the greenhouse they hung the letter on the wall, next to Maggie's plaque, next to a jar of saved heirloom seeds. Because some words don't just grow flowers, they grow people. The years passed gently on Carter Farm, the way seasons do when no one's trying to outrun them. The wildflower fields returned each spring, thicker and brighter than the year before. The greenhouse never stood empty, not even in the frost of January. And the rows of vegetables, once tended by just 2 pairs of hands, now stretched farther than the eye could see, planted by many, harvested by all. Children ran barefoot through the orchards that now wrapped around the farmhouse, chasing each other between the pear trees and ducking beneath branches heavy with fruit. Their laughter mixed with the rustle of leaves and the soft lowing of cows in the distance. Claire sat on the porch in a weathered rocking chair, a circle of little ones at her feet, reading aloud from a book worn soft at the edges. They leaned in, wide-eyed, as she spoke of seeds, of sunlight, of stories rooted in the earth. Behind the barn, John moved through the garden with slow, practiced grace. His hair was whiter now, his steps a little heavier, but his touch with the soil had only grown wiser. He didn't teach farming from books, he taught it from feel, showed students how to know when the ground was ready, how to listen to what it needed, how to tell the difference between a weed and a late bloomer. The Margaret Carter Center had grown into more than a school. It was a sanctuary for those starting over, veterans learning to plant peace, mothers learning to trust again, young men who'd never known softness learning how to coax green from the ground with their own hands. Visitors came from everywhere, not just to learn, but to remember, because the story had spread through letters, through whispers, through that quiet page in a seed catalog. They came wanting to see it for themselves, the place where a tired woman knocked on a stranger's door, where a man with nothing to spare still shared his last bowl of stew, where dignity didn't need dollars and kindness grew like roots beneath the frost. And everyone who stood under those wide sunlit skies came to understand the truth. It started with one shared meal, and it fed the world.